April 13, 1986, 1:45 p.m. Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A grey Bic is parked on a quiet street near Bay 8th Street. It's the kind of place where people recognize faces, where conversations happen on sidewalks, and where nothing truly unexpected is supposed to happen in broad daylight. Then the car explodes. Not a small blast. Not something contained. A full detonation, violent enough to shatter nearby windows, rupture a gas line, and send a column of black smoke rising fast enough to be seen blocks away. Witnesses later described the same thing: a flash, then pressure, then confusion. The kind of confusion that comes from something happening too quickly to process. Clothes catch fire, debris scatters. People run without fully understanding what they're running from. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution designed to be heard. At the center of it is a man named Frank DeCicco. He's 50 years old. Not a reckless soldier, not someone new to the life. He's experienced, positioned, and deeply connected. The kind of person who doesn't end up in explosions by accident. Which raises the real question. How does someone like that, someone careful, someone embedded in power, end up as the target of something this deliberate? To answer that, you have to go back before the explosion, before the smoke, before the moment everything caught up to him. You have to understand the role he played in a much bigger shift. Frank DeCicco was not built for attention. He didn't cultivate an image. He didn't seek out visibility. In a world where reputation could be built through fear or spectacle, he chose something quieter, something more durable. He built relationships. Born in Brooklyn in 1935, DeCicco grew up around the edges of organized crime, not outside it. By the time he was an adult, he wasn't trying to break into that world. He was already part of it. And over time, he developed a reputation that mattered more than notoriety. He was reliable. That word carries weight in that environment. Reliable doesn't just mean competent. It means predictable under pressure. It means you don't create problems. It means when something needs to be handled, money, influence, negotiations, you can be trusted to handle it without drawing unnecessary attention. DeCicco operated in areas that rarely made headlines but controlled outcomes: labor racketeering, union influence, and the kind of business relationships that quietly generated leverage. These weren't visible moves, but they shaped how power flowed. He understood something essential. Power isn't just about who gives orders. It's about who makes those orders possible. That understanding is what moved him closer to the center. By the early 1980s, DeCicco had established himself within the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful organized crime groups in New York. And within that structure, proximity mattered. He was close to Paul Castellano. Castellano wasn't a traditional street boss. He didn't rely on theatrics or intimidation in the open. By the time he reached the top, he operated more like an executive than a gang leader. His focus was on structure, revenue, and control. Construction, food distribution, unions, gambling, these were systems, not hustles. Castellano's authority came from managing those systems efficiently. He wanted stability, discipline, predictability, and for people like DeCicco, that environment made sense. It rewarded intelligence over noise. It favored people who could manage complexity instead of creating chaos. For a time, that alignment worked. DeCicco rose with Castellano, not publicly, not dramatically, but steadily. The kind of rise that doesn't attract attention until it's already happened. But stability in that world is never permanent. And while Castellano represented control, there was another force building inside the same organization, one that didn't operate the same way. John Gotti. Where Castellano was reserved, Gotti was visible. Where Castellano emphasized structure, Gotti embodied movement. He understood something different about power, not just how to hold it, but how to project it. Gotti came up under a different influence, Aniello Della Croce, a powerful underboss who represented the more traditional, street-oriented side of the family. That faction valued toughness, presence, and direct action. Gotti fit that model. He dressed sharply, spoke confidently, and didn't avoid attention. He used it. To some, that made him reckless. To others, it made him effective. Because visibility in the right context creates momentum. And momentum can become its own kind of authority. By the mid-1980s, the Gambino family wasn't unified, it was divided. Not officially, not on paper, but in practice. There were two different visions of how power should operate. Castellano's version controlled, business-oriented, disciplined. Gotti's version assertive, visible, and closer to the street. Neither side was inherently weak. That's what made the situation unstable, because when two strong approaches exist inside the same structure, conflict doesn't happen immediately. It builds, quietly, gradually, through disagreements, through resentment, through small shifts in loyalty, and eventually, it reaches a point where coexistence stops being possible. This is where Frank DeCicco's position becomes critical. He wasn't fully on one side. He had Castellano's trust. That came from years of reliability, from operating within the system Castellano preferred. But he also had access to Gotti. Not necessarily allegiance, but communication, understanding, the ability to navigate conversations that others couldn't. That made him valuable. But it also made him exposed. Because in a divided system, neutrality doesn't last. Being connected to both sides can look like flexibility, right up until it starts to look like risk. And once it looks like risk, the perception changes fast. By 1985, external pressure intensified everything. Federal investigations were expanding. Surveillance methods were improving. Wiretaps were capturing conversations that previously would have stayed private. Castellano himself was under serious legal pressure. Indictments were mounting. The kind of cases that didn't just threaten individuals, they threatened the structure around them. At the same time, members of Gotti's circle were being exposed through recorded conversations involving narcotics. That created another problem. Castellano had a strict stance against drug trafficking, not out of principle, but out of calculation. Drug charges brought longer sentences. Longer sentences created pressure, and pressure made people cooperate. Now both sides were vulnerable, not equally, not in the same ways, but enough that the balance was shifting. In that environment, loyalty becomes less about identity and more about outcome. People stop asking who they align with. They start asking who will still be standing in 6 months. For someone like DeCicco, that question isn't abstract. It's immediate. Because being in the middle means you don't just observe the shift. You feel it first. And this is the moment where everything begins to move. Not publicly, not all at once, but through conversations, through calculations, through decisions that don't seem irreversible until they are. DeCicco had spent years building a position based on understanding both sides. Now that same position forced him into a choice. Not choosing was no longer an option. Because when power starts to realign, the people in the middle don't stay there. They get pulled. Or they get removed. By late 1985, the situation inside the Gambino family had reached a point where pressure alone was no longer enough to hold things together. The divide between Paul Castellano and John Gotti wasn't just philosophical anymore. It had become operational. Castellano was under indictment in the Federal Commission case, one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in American history. At the same time, he was facing additional charges tied to a major auto theft ring. The legal pressure wasn't temporary. It was structural. If it held, it threatened not just his freedom, but his ability to lead. On the other side, Gotti's faction had its own problem. Wiretaps were picking up conversations about narcotics. That was more than a violation of internal rules. It was a direct contradiction of Castellano's authority. If those conversations held up in court, they didn't just expose individuals. They exposed the gap between what the boss demanded and what was actually happening. That gap matters, because once a boss is seen as unable to enforce his own rules, control starts to erode. And when control erodes, alternatives begin to look viable. Frank DeCicco was positioned close enough to see all of this in real time. He understood the legal pressure on Castellano. He understood the growing confidence in Gotti's camp. And more importantly, he understood the speed at which things were shifting. This wasn't a slow decline. It was compression. Events that might normally take years were unfolding in months, which meant decisions had to be made faster and with less certainty. The turning point came in early December 1985. Aniello Delacroce, the underboss and the key buffer between Castellano and the street faction, died. That mattered more than anything else. Delacroce wasn't just a high-ranking figure, he was a stabilizer. He maintained balance between two competing styles of leadership. As long as he was alive, conflict could be managed without escalation. Once he was gone, that buffer disappeared overnight. Now there was nothing between Castellano and Gotti, no mediator, no delay. Just a direct confrontation waiting to happen. From that point forward, the question wasn't whether something would happen. It was who would act first. The plan that followed wasn't chaotic. It was structured. For something this significant, a hit on a boss, random violence wasn't an option. It had to be decisive, visible, and fast enough to prevent any response. The location was Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Public but controlled, predictable but not exposed. Castellano was expected to arrive for a meeting on December 16, 1985. The timing, the positioning, the approach, none of it could be improvised. It required coordination, confidence, and insider knowledge. This is where DeCicco's role becomes critical. He wasn't one of the shooters. He wasn't the face of the operation. But based on later accounts, he provided something just as important. Certainty. In operations like this, uncertainty is what causes hesitation. Hesitation is what causes failure. If the people executing the plan believe the timing is wrong, or that the target won't be where expected, the entire structure collapses. DeCicco's position allowed him to reduce that uncertainty. He understood Castellano's movements. He understood the internal dynamics, and he was in a position to validate the plan. That doesn't make him visible. It makes him essential. December 16, 1985. Just after 15 p.m. Castellano arrives outside Sparks Steakhouse. He steps out of the passenger side of the car. Within seconds, gunfire begins. The shooters move quickly, wearing similar clothing, beige trench coats and hats, designed to create confusion and uniformity. The goal isn't just to kill. It's to control the moment, to make the event happen so fast that there's no time for reaction. Castellano is hit multiple times. His underboss Thomas Bellotti is also shot and killed. The entire sequence lasts seconds. No hesitation, no recovery, just execution. John Gotti isn't in the immediate scene. He's nearby watching, not for spectacle, but for confirmation. In operations like this, confirmation matters. If the target survives even briefly, the entire situation changes. Retaliation becomes immediate. Control becomes uncertain. Gotti waits until he knows. Then he moves. Within hours, the structure of the Gambino family begins to shift. There's no formal announcement, no official transition. But the message is clear. The boss is dead, and the man responsible is still standing. That's enough. Gotti takes control, not through procedure, but through outcome. In that world, authority isn't always granted, it's demonstrated, and a successful hit at that level is the strongest demonstration possible. Frank DeCicco rises with him. He becomes underboss, second in command. That position signals something important. This wasn't a loose operation carried out by lower-level figures. It had structure, it had coordination, and it had reward. DeCicco's promotion confirms his role, not publicly but internally. It tells others that he wasn't just aware of the shift. He helped enable it. For a brief period, this looks like a complete transition. Old leadership removed, new leadership established, internal structure reorganized. From the outside, it appears decisive. From the inside, it's unstable. Because there's one problem that hasn't been addressed. Legitimacy. In organized crime, there are rules that exist beyond individual families. They aren't always written, but they are enforced. One of those rules is simple. A boss cannot be killed without approval from the commission, the governing body representing the major families. That rule isn't about respect. It's about preventing chaos. If every family could remove leadership without coordination, the entire system would collapse into continuous conflict. Gotti ignored that rule. Completely. To his supporters, that made him strong. To others, it made him dangerous. Not just as a rival, but as a destabilizing force. Because if one family could break that rule without consequence, others might follow. And that's the kind of precedent the system can't absorb. This is where the success of the operation becomes its biggest liability. The hit worked. But because it worked without approval, it created a new problem, one that couldn't be ignored. Frank DeCicco is now directly tied to that problem. Not just as underboss, but as someone who helped make the transition possible. He isn't just part of the new leadership. He's evidence of how it happened. And in a system built on control, evidence of instability becomes a target. At this point, DeCicco may have believed he had secured his position. The logic would make sense. He backed the winning side. He rose in rank. He became essential to the new structure. From a surface perspective, that looks like stability. But power at that level doesn't operate on surface logic. It operates on perception across the entire network. And outside the Gambino family, the perception was clear. This wasn't a clean transition. It was a violation. That perception doesn't stay theoretical. It turns into response. Not immediately, not publicly, but through planning, through alignment between other families who now have a shared interest. Restoring balance. And when balance is restored in that world, it isn't done through negotiation. It's done through consequence. By April 1986, the response had already been decided, not publicly, not officially, but within the structure that governed organized crime. The conclusion was clear. The balance had to be restored, and restoring balance meant sending a message that couldn't be ignored. April 13, 1986, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A meeting wraps up at a local social club. Frank DeCicco steps outside with another associate. The street looks ordinary, cars parked, people moving, nothing out of place. DeCicco walks toward a grey Bic. There's no hesitation, no visible threat. Then, a flash. The explosion rips through the car with enough force to shake the block. Windows shatter. Smoke surges upward. The sound carries far beyond the immediate street. Witnesses freeze before they react. Then everything moves at once. People run. Others try to understand what just happened. But the message is already clear. This wasn't random. This was precise. Investigators would later suggest that John Gotti himself may have been the intended target, that the bomb was placed with the expectation he would be there. But whether the target was Gotti or DeCicco doesn't change the outcome, because DeCicco still represented the same thing. The success of an unsanctioned power shift. He didn't die because he was careless. He died because he was visible. Visible as underboss. Visible as a participant. Visible as proof that the rules had been broken and that someone had benefited from it. In that world, visibility at the wrong moment is fatal. The message worked. John Gotti increased his security immediately. He moved differently, traveled with protection, and understood that taking power had not ended the conflict, it had escalated it. And while he survived that moment, the system didn't forget. Years later, federal prosecutors using surveillance and insider testimony built the case that finally brought him down. In 1992, he was convicted. Not just for leadership, but for the very act that made him boss in the first place. Frank DeCicco never reached that point. His story ended on a Brooklyn street, in a blast designed to be remembered. Not because of who he was alone, but because of what he represented. In the mafia, loyalty isn't permanent. It lasts only as long as it serves power. DeCicco helped build a throne. He stood beside the king, and within months, he was erased. Because in that system, you can help change everything, and still not survive it.